Welcome to the Freedom California podcast. I'm your host, Samuel Coleman, California Outreach Director for the Freedom Foundation. This week I am joined by Matthew Hayward, Washington Outreach Director, and Ashley Varner, Vice President of Communications. Join us as we discuss the ways that unions lie to their members, the importance of transparency and collective bargaining, and union political spending to defund the police. Stay tuned. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us on the Freedom California podcast. This week, we've got Matt Hayward, the Outreach Director for the Freedom Foundation in Washington. And we've got, again, Ashley Varner, the Vice President of Communications based out in D.C. So, Matt, Ashley, thank you for joining me this week.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So, Matt, there's an important question I like to ask people who come on for the first time. That, of course, being, which is better, Coke or Pepsi?
I prefer soda water.
Soda water. Okay. I've got a third-party guy again. I can't remember who else was a third-partier, but I think somebody liked Dr. Pepper or something like that. That's okay. So the first topic that I wanted to get into was this story that we wrote about on the Freedom Foundation website. A woman from the California School Employees Association, we just kind of gave her the moniker Miss C in order to, protect her identity. She had an issue with her union where she had a problem with her disability accommodation at her workplace, and she went to her union and said, "Hey, can you help me out?" They agreed to help her, but what they didn't know at the time was that she had actually ceased her union dues deduction. Once they found out about the fact that she was no longer paying union dues anymore, suddenly there were all sorts of issues that meant that they couldn't help her anymore. Technically disability accommodation isn't in the collective bargaining agreement, so we can't help you with this and we can't help you with that. So she came to us because she felt like she had been discriminated against. So, Matt, the question that I want to ask you to start out with here, have you run into any similar issues like this in Washington where it seems like the union is discriminating against non-members?
Yeah, although I would say typically it's usually more of a threat not to be there for people than actually following through with it.
Well, have you seen any situations where it's been more than a threat?
I get a lot of complaints. I would have to go back and look. But nothing that jumps out off the top of my head. I do remember reading something, though. I don't know that it was from Washington. It may have been from one of our other states about not providing masks to non-members.
Right.
I believe that happened in Ohio, Matt, not providing masks to people who had left the union and resigned their membership. And I think one of the reasons that we don't necessarily have more examples of this is because it is a very effective intimidation tactic that prevents people from resigning their union membership in the first place. So if they're told, we're not going to represent you, we're not going to bring lawyers to your defense, we're not going to take care of you, even though they are legally, as school employees, they are legally required to because they have brought themselves in and forced themselves as the sole representation for school employees. They're counting on people to not know their rights, again, as we talk about often on this podcast. And so I think the reason we don't have more examples of that is because they rightly scare people out of leaving by saying they're not going to provide the services that they are legally required to do.
They do keep them in the dark. I hear about that quite frequently. I've been getting several calls in the last few weeks about that with the unknown surrounding COVID and getting back to work. People are calling up that have opted out and telling me that they want to know what's going on, and their shop steward and union tells them, well, if you'd like to be in the know, then you should pay your union dues. We're not going to tell you what's happening with negotiations and what's going on.
Right. And that is one of the things, especially in California, that there is, a statutory understanding that unions, don't need to do everything for non-members, but there are certain things that unions have to do. For example, if you cease your union dues deduction, they can't withhold any pay, they can't withhold benefits from you, they can't take away your paid time off. But really anything else that's in the collective bargaining agreement is also, considered something that needs to be applied equally to all members, regardless of, or I guess, equal to all employees, regardless of membership status. So, Matt, is there something like that in Washington too?
Yeah, there's a state law that has to do with representation. So they have to provide fair representation. And that falls under the exclusive representation clause that was passed at the state level, which has been done in, I believe, every state, giving the union the exclusive right of representation of the defined bargaining unit. And that's kind of a double-edged sword, of course, because it provides the so-called benefits to the person who opts out, but it also does not allow them to have a voice. So the union is their voice whether they like it or not. So even if they think they could do a better job negotiating on their own behalf or representing themselves, they're not allowed to.
Right.
And that's why the whole argument that unions try to make about forced free riders, it's not free riders, it's forced riders, right? Because these people would rather negotiate their own terms. They don't want the union negotiating their terms for them. They know what they would prefer to have as a job benefit, other negotiations that you would otherwise make with your employer. So it's not free riders, it's forced riders.
And you know what? It's interesting is that a lot of union members would agree and say, hey, let them represent themselves. We don't want to represent them any longer. But it's the union leadership that is opposed to that because they prefer having a monopoly, and competition would interfere with their monopolized business model.
Right. And it's funny that you bring that up because my mother, who's been a state employee in Washington State for quite a while now, regularly complains that she wishes that she could represent herself. She opted out pretty much the day Janice came out, or she was already a fee payer. So she regularly complains that the dinky, 1.2% raise they get her every year is like, kind of insulting for how she views her own labor. But I think this kind of goes to a bigger point, which is, so we've kind of talked about how when you opt out, you don't really lose, your pay, your benefits, anything like that. But you do lose something, which we kind of touched on, which is you do lose this ability to be in the know of the union. You might lose access to a newsletter or to some sort of internal messaging board. I actually spoke to somebody the other day who said, my union isn't letting me on their Facebook page anymore, which is, not something that I had encountered yet, was, being kept off of sort of like a third-party communication. So Matt, what do you typically hear from public employees, or what in your experience do you think is the critical thing that people lose when they opt out? Or is there anything that important that they lose when they opt out?
There are some things that can be lost. They're typically members-only benefits. So it's kind of like a Groupon-style discount that some unions offer. Typically, the discounts they're offering, you could go out in the private market and buy a coupon booklet and get the same or better deals. So it's usually not anything that impressive. But unions have created those incentives so that they are able to tell people legitimately that you do lose something when you opt out. You don't lose anything, as you've mentioned, Sam, in your collective bargaining agreement. Anything that was negotiated between the union and the employer, that is sound. They can't take that away.
Right.
But they can go beyond that, though, and say, hey, we cut a deal with an amusement park to give 10% off to our members, and that only applies to our members. And so those are usually the types of things that people lose. And it's very uncommon for me to talk to somebody who says they actually use them. And in the past, there's been a few times where I have talked to someone and they were asking me, and I told them, look, it's an ROI question. You have to determine if you're getting your dues worth, not me. So how much money are you saving off of that? And overall, do you feel like you're getting your money's worth?
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because most people, I typically tell people the same thing, which is, this is a determination that you have to make. And once I get done telling them of these things that, they'll lose out on, if you can call it that. And they're like, well, I don't use that crap anyways. I don't care about any of that. And I remember, Matt, when I originally started working at the Freedom Foundation, I was having a conversation with you and you were telling me about it was like this members only perk where you would get free vision or free dental insurance or something like that. And we looked it up, and it was like one hospital somewhere out in the middle of Eastern Washington that no one is, this is like a Western Washington based union, and you get free dental if you go drive 4 hours to Eastern Washington and go to that doctor. So I think a lot of public employees think that if they opt out, they're going to lose something big. But what it usually comes to is it's these weird little things that people end up losing out on that they probably don't make use of in the first place.
Well, and it's great, again, for a legitimate sales pitch for them to say you're losing something, right?
Yeah.
And healthcare and dental, those are going to be big things. So again, the union provides a supplemental insurance, so it's not insurance, and it has nothing to do with the insurance that you get or don't get from your employer, but it's something else. And the teachers union, I think, is one of the most famous for this, right? Providing a supplemental insurance policy that's actually owned by the NEA and not by the member or local union itself. And people know very little about it, and it is up at their discretion to use it, allow it to be used by you or not. And teachers just don't understand that they're covered and insured by their district. And this supplemental insurance provided by the union is garbage, and it's not what they need. And the union campaigns really hard on that particular issue, threatening teachers that, what happens if a child accuses you of, hitting them or doing something. And so they use this fear monger that's emotional. And in that position, I can understand a teacher where they think, geez, I'm not sure about this. I think that maybe they're trying to pull one over on me, but if there's even a slight chance that that's true and this will provide me protection, it's worth just paying the extra money. And so it's an easy sell for the union to use that kind of fear to sell them a garbage product.
Right. So what I'd like to sort of move on to here is a bit of a different topic. This would be, Matt, I know this is something that you've worked personally on quite a bit, which is the transparency in Lincoln County. Could you tell us a little bit about, where that project came from and where it's going?
Well, that's a long story, so I'll try to keep it somewhat short. Years ago, the Freedom Foundation, long before the Janus decision, before even the Harris v. Quinn decision, giving some public employees right to work protections, the Freedom Foundation was pushing for local activists to go and get initiatives at local, county, and city levels to push for right to work at the local level, and also transparency with collective bargaining negotiations, to open their collective bargaining negotiation process to the public, where our elected officials are negotiating the salaries of public employees, which in most governments, that's the largest expense in the local government. And the end of that product is public, but the process to get there isn't public.
Right.
And in many cases, the number one funding donor to these elected officials are the very entities, these public sector unions, that are going and negotiating for our money. So there's a clear appearance of a conflict of interest, and they go and negotiate behind closed doors. So speeding forward, we thought that it would be an easier sell getting the transparency resolution passed across the state, and figured it would just sweep across the state, and then we'd go back to doing the push for right to work. Little did we know that it would be the battle that it is for the transparency. And also we've had some Supreme Court decisions that have moved right to work forward, at least for the public sector since then as well. But Lincoln County was the first local government in Washington state to move forward and pass that resolution to open their collective bargaining to the public. And that was in 2016. Of course, the Teamsters came forward and filed an unfair labor practice. And they refused to negotiate. And we actually stepped in with Lincoln County and filed an unfair labor practice against the Teamsters for refusing to negotiate mandatory subjects of bargaining. And then they made a counterclaim arguing that Lincoln County had made an unfair labor practice. And here we are 4 years later, still in the courts battling this issue.
Okay. So what is the union's goal here exactly in this push to stop transparency? What exactly do they gain by keeping, things so in the dark?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things is they control the narrative, right? I mean, that's pretty valuable. Again, we talked about earlier about people right now who have opted out wanting to know what's going on with like their negotiations. You know, we have bus drivers who are going, hey, we heard the teachers are going back to work. We want to know what's going on with us. Are we being furloughed? And the union says, well, you're not privy to know, get updates from the collective bargaining process because you're not a union member. So it's a power play, right? They control the information. And it also allows them to control it any way they want to create a narrative. And most commonly you hear them come back and say, they leak things to the press. There's been famous nationwide and statewide collective bargaining agreements that have come to impasses where the union has gone public and said that management is refusing to negotiate and management's refusing to give us reasonable raises. Of course, that's another thing they're able to hide. They can go in and ask for a 26% raise, which if they did in the public would probably sound outrageous, and it would make negotiating more difficult for the union. But for the union, it's beneficial because it's not public. And if they end up going to binding arbitration later on, they're able to use that and say, hey, look, we started here and then we brought it down and we asked for less and we asked for less and management won't budge. You know, they're only moving a little bit. We've moved way down and asked for way less than we originally asked for. So there's actually a few different reasons why it's beneficial to them to not have the public see what's going on, both for their members as well as for the public, as well as for if they can't come to a conclusion and they end up in the bureaucracy of the state to come up to a resolution.
Right. Ashley, I want to give you a chance to jump in here if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you. I am always suspect when someone does not want me to know what's going on in a negotiation when I'm the one paying the bills. I am fond of saying, this is our money. As the taxpayers, whatever negotiation agreement they come to is paid by the taxpayers. If we're the ones writing the checks, we should be able to see what's going on behind those closed doors. We should be able to see, as Matt described, what are they really asking for that we don't get to know about? Where did they start versus where did they finish? Everything that they do on both sides of the table, it's the local officials who are getting campaign dollars from these union officials and the union officials who are making deals with government to grow government to then hire more people that will then bring in more union dollars, right? So both of them are negotiating with each other for terms that will benefit both parties, and we're paying for it. I am always suspect when unions say that we don't have a right to know what they're negotiating with our money.
No, I would absolutely agree. So Matt, this may be a question you might or not know. Have we done any polling about what the public generally thinks about transparency and collective bargaining?
We have. Actually, there's been a few polls, including, and there was actually a vote to change the Spokane City Council's charter this last election cycle, and it passed with a supermajority to force the city in their charter to open their collective bargaining. But we also did a poll a few years ago that showed 70% of support from Washingtonians for opening the collective bargaining process to the public. So there's wild support for it. There is support from it from union members themselves, run-of-the-mill members. How shocking that the employees that their wages are being negotiated have an interest in knowing what's going on in the collective bargaining.
Who would have thought?
They're not only willing to take the word from their shop steward who says, oh, trust me, I'll come back and tell you what happened. It's like, well, that's nice, but, as Reagan said, trust but verify. If I can see it, let me see it, And Lincoln County actually did have one negotiating session in public that went off without a hitch. And guess who showed up for it? A bunch of the people from the bargaining unit, not the public. There wasn't a lot of people from the public. The principle is good that the public could be there. There was a reporter there that goes to all of the county commissioner meetings, except for the closed meetings. This one was open, so he was there to report on what happened. And again, I think that the irony is that it was the union members themselves that showed up to see what was happening in the bargaining process.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick little break here, and then we will be right back, so stick around. If you like what we do and you want to see more of it, please consider making a small financial contribution. The Freedom Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit and all donations are 100% tax deductible. Visit freedomfoundation.com/donate. Matt, Ashley, thank you for sticking around after our little break. So as we were talking about before the break, transparency and collective bargaining is typically pretty popular among union members, among the public. It's only really the union leadership that has an issue with transparency and collective bargaining. And I think this fits really well into something that we've been seeing lately, which is this sort of newfound public disapproval of police officers' unions. And a lot of these pro-union folks have been saying for a long time that what we really need to sort of flush out, the bad police officers, whatever you want to call them, is we need more transparency when it comes to, the collective bargaining around police officers' contracts. So, Matt, I want to toss this over to you since you wrote a really great story about it for the Freedom Foundation about a week ago. Your story, which was titled, Are Your Dues Putting Your Own Life at Risk? Life and Property at Risk, rather. How does that tie into this?
Sure. So we've been having rallies all over the country, and we've been having lots of rallies and protests in Seattle and Portland. And back in June, there was a rather large rally, and the Teamsters 117, representing corrections officers and others in Washington, came out, and many of the union members came out in support and went out and actually marched in this demonstration protest with people carrying signs that said defund the police, you've seen the signs, all sorts of terrible negative things about the police, violence towards the police. And they got such backlash by their own membership within the first 48 hours or so after that happened that the secretary treasurer actually came out and had to make a public statement about that, saying that essentially that the union supports going and joining these protests and participating in the social justice movement. And of course, the question that you've got to ask is why would you have unions going out and asking to defund the police? And I mean, I think that that's where we're at right now with that. Obviously, defunding the police makes us less safe, not more safe. And unions, obviously, they have their own police guild. And obviously, there's a lot of conflict there with having unions going out. And so we've been getting a lot of people reaching out to us, telling us that they're unhappy with what's going on in their union. And for us, it's a little bit shocking because unions are always talking about unity and strength in numbers and how important it is to be unified. And yet they're getting involved in some of the most divisive things that are going on in public. And it's showing with their people who are opting out and contacting our office every day.
Right. And I think this goes to a bigger point. Do unions gain anything by opposing the police? Is this some sort of ploy to get extra funding to the, Department of Health? Is this, what's the point?
I honestly don't know, other than the fact that unions have increasingly outright been moving away from the nuts and bolts of what unions came about for, which is to go out and fight for better working conditions, wages, and benefits. And they are moving away from that model, especially public sector unions, to be a social justice movement, to be a political arm. And they have very openly, in many instances, admitted that that is the direction they are going. Not to say that they're not interested in all in the main things, but that is quickly becoming more of a secondary issue, and direct political action and social justice reform and social movements is really where unions are going.
Ashley, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's upsetting to see public sector unions going against the police force. And we've seen this in California, though, right, with the teachers union saying they're not going to go back to the classroom in Los Angeles County until we defund the police and provide Medicare for all and take out school resource officers. How does that make the children any safer at schools if you take out the officers who are there to protect them? It's become blatantly political, and that's I think that's why every time we have had, and Matt could probably speak to this, you could too probably, Sam, I know that in several of our states we have sent mailers to the homes of public sector employees saying, do you know that your union has funded the Defund the Police movement? Do you know that your union has spent this much money on such and such political campaign? And there has been such an outcry. We really have received a lot of calls and opt-out letters from people saying, you know, I never really thought about how happy I was with my union, but I certainly don't want my money going to fund this. Right. So they've just kind of let the veil or the mask, if you will, slip.
It's amusing that I often am told that it isn't political. They believe that they are so right in what they're doing that they don't even view it as political. Their deep driven political involvement to them isn't even political. It's just the right thing to do. And it's kind of shocking how delusional they are to come out and literally try and make the argument that it's not politics, that it's not political. They don't all do that, but I do hear that argument, especially online and in forums. And it's like, well, you may not think so, but all of the people who disagree with you sure do. And
and back to your point, Matt, when they get away from the nuts and bolts of protecting the workplace and wages and their employees, at the end of the day, even if what they are doing is correct, that's money. I want my money back. I don't want my money going to that. You know, if someone, even if a union member agreed with the entire political agenda that they're pushing, they can decide how much of their own money they want to send to fund that agenda.
Right.
So.
I mean, that's what I always told my canvassers when they were going door to door to talk to union members is that the fact that the union is funding Planned Parenthood isn't a matter of politics and right and left or pro-choice and pro-life. You could be talking to somebody who has a Planned Parenthood sticker on their bumper and they love Planned Parenthood and they're pro-choice. And that doesn't change the fact that they may not want to be monthly contributors.
Right.
You know, they didn't hire the union to represent their political views and donate their money on their behalf. They hired that union to represent them in their workplace for their workplace conditions, benefits, and retirement. It just doesn't make sense that they can come in and claim that everyone is looking for a political advocate to speak for them as a condition of employment, right?
Well, see, but if you're a union, you don't view it as political, right? You know, you're just doing the right thing. They're just out there being the good guys.
With my money.
Yes, with your money.
Fortunately,
money.
Fortunately, the United States Supreme Court ruled otherwise, and it is political speech, and they do have a First Amendment right to cease those union deductions.
Well, that's exactly right. Well, I think that's about all the time that we have here for today. So again, Matt, Ashley, thank you for joining me. And to everyone who watched this at home, thanks for tuning in. And we will see you next week.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks.